The clang of steel echoed through the factory floor, sharp and familiar as a memory I'd spent half my life trying to bury. From behind the one-way glass, I watched the man in the hard hat, Raymond Holt, slam a clipboard onto the concrete, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "You call that stacking? My granddaughter could do better." The young worker flinched. Everyone around him pretended not to notice. That was Raymond's power. His cruelty lived in the silence he created. 15 years ago, that same voice had followed me into the rain, shouting, "You're a useless piece of junk. Caleb, don't come back." My clothes had landed in the mud, one by one, like trash being thrown out. I still remember the sound of the door slamming behind me, the final punctuation mark of a childhood that ended too soon. Now that same man was standing on my production floor, barking orders in my company. He didn't know that the new regional operations director, whose arrival everyone whispered about, was the boy he'd left to shiver on a Kansas street. I straightened my tie, the motion automatic after years of corporate habits that never quite erased the small-town dirt under my skin. My reflection in the glass was calm professional, every inch the man I had built myself to be. But inside, something old stirred the trembling hands of a 17-year-old kid clutching a garbage bag, promising himself that one day he'd be more than the name he'd been given. Mr. Morgan Harper's voice pulled me back. She stood beside me, tablet in hand, sharp-eyed and steady. Harper Lynn had worked under Raymond for 3 years before she quit, before I recruited her back. I saw the way her jaw tightened when she looked at him. He'd humiliated her once in front of the entire crew, said she was too soft for real work. She never forgot. And neither did I. "He's been terrorizing the new hires all morning," she said quietly. "Want me to call him up now?" I looked down again. Raymond strutted between the machines a little slower than he used to be, his back not quite as straight, but his arrogance untouched. Watching him, I realized something unexpected. I didn't hate him anymore. The anger had burned out long ago, leaving only a strange, cold clarity. "Not yet," I said. "Let him feel safe a little longer." Harper nodded and turned away, her heels clicking softly against the floor. I stayed by the window, letting the scene unfold like a movie I'd already seen too many times. The air smelled of oil and iron and justice slowly taking shape. In a few minutes, he would walk through my door confident as ever, still believing the world owed him respect. He wouldn't realize until too late that the boy he'd thrown away had built an empire from the pieces. I stood there a moment longer after Harper left, watching Raymond's figure fade between the machines. The hum of the factory blurred into another sound, the steady patter of rain on a tin roof long ago. Memory isn't polite. It sneaks in when you least expect it, dragging you backward whether you want it or not. 15 years earlier, the world had felt smaller, meaner. Dodge City, Kansas flatland, endless wind, a town that smelled of dust and gasoline. Back then, I was 17, living in a faded yellow house with my mother Linda, my little sister Rosie, and the man she'd married barely a year earlier, Raymond Holt, a former Marine out of work with hands like sandpaper and a voice that filled every corner of the house. At first he tried. I'll give him that. He brought flowers for Mom, built Rosie a swing in the backyard, even offered to make a man out of me. But control was his way of loving, if you could call it that. He decided what we ate, where we went, how loud we could laugh. The more he talked about discipline, the less oxygen there seemed to be in that house. I liked school. Machines fascinated me, the way parts fit together to make something that worked. I dreamed about studying mechanical engineering, maybe even leaving Kansas. Raymond thought dreams were for weak men. Books don't pay bills, he'd say, flicking his cigarette into the yard. You want to learn about engines? Fix the damn mower. Mom never argued. She just lowered her eyes and wiped her hands on the dish towel like she could scrub away her fear. When I turned 17, I started working nights at a gas station down on Wyatt Street. I saved every dollar in an old cigar box under my bed money for college applications, maybe a bus ticket out. 2 years of secret hope wrapped in rubber bands. Then one gray afternoon I came home and found my mattress, flipped drawers, emptied clothes thrown on the floor. Raymond stood in the middle of the mess, holding my cigar box. "You stealing from me now, boy," he said, calm, in that way that made your stomach knot. "That's my money," I told him. "I earned it." He laughed. "You live under my roof, eat my food. Everything you touch is mine." He opened the front door and tossed the box out into the yard. Bills scattered into puddles, floating like wounded birds. Then came the suitcase, my shoes, my textbooks, my life thrown piece by piece. Mom stood behind him, lips trembling, but said nothing. Rosie screamed, "Stop it!" and ran to me, pressing a photograph into my hand, our father in uniform, smiling from another lifetime. The rain came hard then. I remember the cold soaking through my jacket, the gravel biting my palms as I gathered what I could. The neighbor, Mr. George, watched from his porch and muttered, "Ain't my business." Maybe he was right. That night, everything that was anyone's business stopped being mine. I walked until the houses thinned and the road turned to mud, clutching that photograph so tight the edges cut my skin. Somewhere between thunderclaps, I made myself a promise I would never come back. Not to that house, not to that name, not to that kind of smallness again. The rain didn't stop that night, not even when my legs gave out. I must have walked 10 miles along the back roads of Dodge City, past empty fields and rusted mailboxes, my suitcase dragging behind me like an anchor. The mud sucked at my shoes, each step heavier than the last. When I finally saw the faint porch light at the edge of the Morgan farm, I thought it might be a trick of exhaustion. But it was real. Grandma Evelyn's light had always been steady, even when everything else flickered. I remember the sound of her screen door creaking open before I could even knock. She stood there in her nightgown and flannel robe, gray hair pinned back, eyes sharp, behind those big glasses she never took off. She didn't ask a single question. She just opened her arms and said, "You're home now, sweetheart." The warmth of her house hit me like mercy. The smell of wood smoke, the faint scent of lavender soap. She wrapped me in one of her knitted blankets, the kind with uneven stitches, and handed me a mug of cocoa so thick it felt like forgiveness. "You can tell me when you're ready," she said. I wasn't ready that night, or for many nights after. But she didn't push. Evelyn understood silence. She'd been a widow for almost 20 years. The farmhouse was old, patched together by time and stubborn love. The roof leaked when it stormed, the radiator clanged like a ghost, and the wood stove ate through firewood faster than we could split it. But it was the first place in years that felt safe. The next morning, she pointed to a pile of wood by the shed and said, "If you're gonna stay here, you'll have to work. Morgans don't sit still." I took a night shift at Murphy's Gas and Repair down by Route 50. Tommy Greer, the owner, was a Vietnam vet with a limp and a dry sense of humor. He taught me how to rebuild carburetors, change brake lines, and more importantly, how to stand up straight, even when life tried to bend you. "You got grit, kid," he'd say. "Don't lose it. The world's full of folks who quit too soon." During the day, I tried to keep up with school. At night, I came home smelling like motor oil hands, raw and cracked. Evelyn would be up, waiting, mending clothes by the fire. Sometimes she hummed old hymns, soft, wordless things that made the house feel alive. One evening, while I was stacking firewood, she called me into the kitchen. On the table was a small envelope, yellowed at the edges. "Your daddy left this before he shipped out," she said quietly. "I didn't know when to give it to you." The letter inside was short, written in his crooked handwriting. "If my boy ever loses his way, remind him that Morgan men never quit." I read it 3 times before the tears came. The fire popped in the stove, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel worthless. I felt like a promise still waiting to be kept. "I won't quit, Dad," I whispered into the quiet room, and meant every word. The letter from my father stayed folded in my wallet, the edges soft from being read too many times. It became my quiet compass, something to hold on to when exhaustion blurred the days together. Life on the farm followed a rhythm of survival school work, a few hours of sleep repeat. I stocked shelves at Morrison's warehouse during the day and pumped gas at Murphy's until midnight. Between shifts, I studied mechanical drawings in the break room, tracing lines with greasy fingers, while the smell of motor oil clung to my clothes. Community college wasn't glamorous, but it was a door one I refused to let close. I took every technical course they offered, often the youngest face in a room full of veterans retraining for second careers. Most days I kept to myself, until one semester I met Professor Elena Rodriguez. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, with dark eyes that saw through excuses like glass. After class one afternoon, she stopped me as I packed up my tools. "You have an instinct for this," she said, pointing at the model engine I'd designed for a class project. "You don't just follow instructions, you solve problems. That's rare." I didn't know how to respond. Praise wasn't something I trusted, but she kept talking about a scholarship program through Fordwell Engineering, a company known across Kansas for designing agricultural machinery. "They're taking one intern this year," she said. "You should apply." Fordwell. The name hit a nerve. I remembered Raymond's voice bragging about his years at that company, how he'd shown those college kids what real men could do. I almost laughed at the irony. I spent a week writing my essay, every word drawn from the years I'd spent trying to rebuild myself. I called it Turning Pain into Precision. I wrote about engines, yes, but also about how people like machines could be rebuilt if you understood the mechanics of failure. I mailed the application the same day I bought an old Chevy pickup for $600. The engine barely turned over, but I rebuilt it piece by piece from scraps Tommy gave me at the shop. The truck became my second classroom, my first real victory. 2 months later, I was called into Professor Rodriguez's office. She was smiling before I even sat down. "Caleb, they want you," she said. "You're the only one they picked this year." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. When I told Grandma Evelyn, she cried softly, the way proud people do when words aren't enough. She baked an apple pie that night and called it our celebration dinner, though we ate it off chipped plates at the kitchen table. The next morning, I drove my old Chevy east toward Wichita, the sunrise painting the road gold. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I didn't know what waited for me, but I felt my father's letter in my pocket steady against my heartbeat. That afternoon, Professor Rodriguez handed me the paperwork. "You'll be working under a man named Frank Fordwell," she said. "The owner's son." I froze for a second, then managed a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. "Fordwell," I said. "That's the company Ray used to brag about. The Fordwell headquarters didn't look like any place I'd ever belonged to." Rows of steel cranes loomed over the lot, sunlight bouncing off the machines like fire on water. The building itself was all glass and precision, every line clean, every sound deliberate. When I walked in that first morning, my reflection followed me down the polished hallway, a kid from Dodge City pretending he knew what he was doing. Frank Fordwell met me the way men like him meet everyone, half smile, firm handshake eyes that measured rather than greeted. "You're the scholarship boy," he said. "Let's see what you can do." He wasn't unkind, just exacting. To him, respect wasn't handed out. It was earned bolt by bolt. They placed me in the operations wing, where engines the size of pickup trucks were born. The air smelled of iron, oil, and ambition. I shadowed engineers twice my age, kept notes, asked questions that annoyed some and impressed others. After hours, I stayed to study inventory spreadsheets no one cared about, searching for patterns that didn't add up. 3 weeks in, I founded a supply management loop that was bleeding money. A simple timing error in material orders, small enough to miss, but costly over time. I reworked the model on my own, stayed past midnight to test it, then brought it to Frank the next morning. He read through my notes slowly, his thumb tracing the margin. "You're saying we could cut waste by 15%, 17, I said quietly. "If we adjust the delivery cycle." He didn't smile, but his eyes lifted for the first time. "That's good work, son." He paused, then added, "Keep it quiet for now. I want to see if you're right." A month later, the new system went live. The savings were more than either of us expected, nearly $200,000 in a quarter. Frank called me into his office, poured 2 cups of coffee, and said, "You've earned your place here, Morgan." I didn't say it out loud, but those words carried a weight my 17-year-old self could never have imagined. One afternoon in the cafeteria, a woman in her 60s stopped beside my table. "Caleb Morgan," she asked. "You're not related to Raymond Holt, are you?" I froze. "He's my stepfather." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "I thought so. I worked under that man back in Wichita. Your stepdad's still the same bully. But karma's patient, honey." Something inside me shifted, a mix of old anger and quiet satisfaction. Maybe karma was patient. Maybe it just needed time to sharpen its edges. A week later, Frank called me into the boardroom. "We're starting a new development initiative," he said. "Operations Fast Track. I want you in it." He leaned back, studying me. "What drives you, son?" I thought of the rain, the suitcase, the voice that called me worthless. Then I looked him in the eye and said, "A man once told me I'd never amount to anything. I'm proving him wrong." 15 years passed quietly, or maybe not so quietly. Success makes its own kind of noise emails at midnight flights before dawn, the hum of hotel air conditioners that never let you sleep. Somewhere between promotions and conference calls, I became the regional director of Fordwell Engineering for the entire Midwest division. The boy who once fixed cars for gas money now oversaw 7 factories and 1,000 employees. People called me sir now, though the word still felt like it belonged to someone else. When I took the position in Wichita, it wasn't revenge that brought me back. It was logistics, at least that's what I told myself. But when Harper handed me the personnel file for the Wichita plant, my eyes stopped on one name: Raymond Holt, Plant Supervisor. The letters seemed heavier than the others, like they carried the weight of every insult he'd ever thrown. "Do you know him?" Harper asked. I took a long breath. "I used to." We said nothing else, but she watched me carefully after that, as if she could sense the storm I was trying not to feed. The morning of the meeting, the factory buzzed with speculation. Everyone wanted to know who the new director was. Raymond strutted across the floor, chin high, telling the crew how the new corporate guy would probably be some soft-handed college kid. "They never last," he said, chuckling. "I'll show him how real work gets done." Harper stood beside me in the observation office tablet pressed against her chest. "He's ready for you," she said softly. "Call him in." She nodded, and the intercom crackled through the building. "Mr. Raymond Holt, please report to the director's office." Minutes later, the door opened. He entered with that same swagger I remembered from my childhood, the posture of a man who thought the world owed him obedience. "Good morning," he said, dropping into the chair without being asked. "Before we start, I want you to know I've been running this place for 15 years. I know every machine, every worker, every screw in this building." I kept my back to him, pretending to review a report. "Is that so?" "Sure. He said, confidence dripping from every word. "This place runs because I run it." I turned in my chair slowly. The light from the window fell across my face. He froze. The words collapsed on his tongue. "Caleb." His voice cracked. "This can't be." "It is," I said quietly. He stared, color draining from his face. "I listened, son. I didn't mean things were different back then. I've got bills, responsibilities. You were right about one thing I said standing. Hard work builds real men. I learned that, just not from you." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I slid a single form across the desk, his transfer order. "You'll be reporting to Amarillo next month, under Sandra Reeves." He blinked. "Sandra. She's a woman you once called unfit for management," I finished. "She'll take good care of you." As he left, shoulders slumped. I didn't feel triumph, just a strange, steady peace. For the first time, the boy he threw away was no longer standing in the rain. The morning after Raymond's transfer, I drove without destination, just west toward the horizon that had once been my escape route. The sky hung low over Kansas, that endless gray I'd known since boyhood. My hands found the steering wheel, the way they always did when my mind grew heavy. I didn't realize where I was going until the gravel road narrowed and the old mailbox appeared. E. Morgan, 412 County Line Road. The farmhouse hadn't changed much. The paint was peeling. The porch sagged a little, and the wind still carried the faint smell of pine and smoke. But it was quiet now, the kind of quiet that hums with memory. Evelyn had been gone for 3 years, but I still half expected her to appear at the door in her flannel robe, coffee mug in hand, asking why I hadn't called. I parked the truck and walked to the porch. The mailbox creaked when I opened it, and inside was a single envelope wrapped in plastic, my name on it, written in her careful, looping handwriting. I stood there a long moment before opening it. "Caleb, forgiveness isn't weakness. It's proof you've grown stronger than what hurt you. You don't owe anyone your peace, but don't let bitterness steal it either. Remember, your heart's still your father's gift, not Raymond's wound. Love, Grandma Evelyn." The words hit harder than I expected. I sat on the porch steps, the Kansas wind pressing against my coat, and let her voice fill the spaces I'd been too proud to admit were still empty. For years, I thought forgiveness meant surrender. But sitting there, I realized it was release, the letting go of something that had lived rent-free in my chest for far too long. Later that afternoon, I stopped by a small diner off Main Street. The waitress led me to a booth by the window, and that's where I saw her mom stirring sugar into her coffee, like she was afraid of the silence between us. She looked older, smaller somehow, but her eyes softened the second she saw me. "Caleb," she whispered, standing halfway before sitting again, unsure. We talked for hours about Raymond, about the years after I left. She told me how the drinking worsened, how one night he threw a chair through the wall, and she finally ran. Rosie helped her start over in Wichita. They'd built a small life together, quiet and steady. Tears came not in a rush, but in small, trembling waves. "I should have protected you," she said. "I chose the roof over our heads instead of the boy under it." I reached across the table, covering her shaking hands. "You don't have to keep apologizing, Mom. You did what you thought would keep us alive." Rosie walked in near closing time. Her nurse scrubs wrinkled her smile wide. "You saving yourself saved us," she said. pulling me into a hug that smelled faintly of antiseptic and home. And in that moment I understood Evelyn's letter completely. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It passes from one heart to another, quiet as light through old windows. 2 years slipped by like pages turning in a book I hadn't meant to finish so quickly. Wichita had changed, new factories, new faces, but every now and then I'd catch a glint of the past in the most ordinary places. Sometimes it was in the smell of motor oil or the sound of rain on a tin roof. Other times, it was in the mirror in the man I'd become without realizing it. The day of the dedication ceremony dawned clear and windless rare for Kansas. Rows of folding chairs filled the courtyard of the new training center, the Evelyn Initiative. A place built for kids who, like me, had nowhere to go but forward. The sign over the doors gleamed silver in the sunlight, her name carved deep into the metal. Harper stood beside me, clipboard in hand, eyes brighter than I'd seen them in years. She'd taken charge of the program, managed grants, recruited mentors, convinced sponsors that giving second chances wasn't charity, but investment. "You did it," she whispered before the ceremony started. "No," I said quietly, looking up at the building. She did. Frank Fordwell stepped to the podium first, his gray suit catching the light. He'd aged, but his voice still carried that calm authority. When Caleb Morgan first came to Fordwell, he didn't just bring skill, he told the crowd. He brought purpose, he turned pain into progress. And today, that purpose will change lives. The applause rose steady and sincere. I caught sight of a few of the first trainees sitting in the front row, teenagers in worn jackets, shoulders tense but hopeful. After the speeches, one of them, a thin boy named Tyler, handed me a folded note. He'd been in the program less than a month. The handwriting was uneven but careful. "You showed me that being thrown away doesn't mean you're trash. It means you're free to start over." I kept the note in my pocket the rest of the day, touching it every so often like a pulse proof that something good had finally taken root. As the crowd thinned and the sun dipped low, I drove out of town. The roads were familiar, lined with the same stubborn fields that had watched me leave years ago. Eventually, I turned down a narrow street I hadn't seen in 15 years. The house was still there. Raymond's old house, though it no longer looked like his. The porch had been painted blue, and a tire swing hung from the oak tree out front. A woman in an apron called to her kids from the doorway, laughter spilling out like music. For a moment I sat there watching the life that had replaced the memory. I rolled down the window and let the evening air fill the cab. "That boy finally came home," I said under my breath. And maybe he had. Not to the house, but to the world, to himself. Because in the end, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's becoming the person your past said you couldn't be, and then giving others the tools to do the same. If this story touched something deep inside you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part spoke to you most. Tell me where you're watching from. It's amazing how far our stories travel. And if you believe in real stories of family pain and redemption, make sure to subscribe to Domestic Tragedy for more heartfelt journeys like this one.